how the spectral reflectance pattern of plants work. We saw why leaves look green and why its color changes in some seasons to brown or yellow or reddish color, right? We saw that characteristics yesterday, right? And water also, again, you saw water has good reflectance in the shorter wavelengths and higher absorption in the longer wavelengths, right? And vegetation, we saw vegetation, I mean the leaves, they appear green because they have high reflectance in the intermediate visible wavelengths, right? The shorter wavelengths and longer wavelengths in the visible range are absorbed and absorbed by chlorophyll, and above that there is high reflectance for vegetation, right? So we saw this pattern yesterday, right? So this water and vegetation, they may reflect somewhat similarly in the visible wavelengths, but they are almost always separable in the infrared range. And this spectral response, it can be quite variable even for the same target type, as we saw yesterday for the same plants. I mean, for the same category like vegetation or plants, the spectral reflectance pattern can be same, right? But at different wavelengths, the spectral reflectance pattern varies, right? At different wavelengths. We saw yesterday how to classify different species of plants, right? So it can be different for different wavelengths. So if you know where to actually spectrally look, in the electromagnetic spectrum, where to look, if you know where to look, and understanding the factors which influence the spectral response of the features of interest, that is very important to correctly interpret the interaction of electromagnetic radiation with the Earth's surface features. So, but again, before we go into the spectral response pattern of Earth features, let us also keep in mind some atmospheric influence. What were the atmospheric influences on electromagnetic radiation in the atmosphere? We saw yesterday, right? What are the two major energy interaction that happens in the atmosphere? What we saw yesterday? Two major energy interactions. One is absorption, and the other one is absorption
Scattering.
and scattering, right? So scattering is also there, right? So while defining the spectral response patterns, you should keep these two influences also in mind. So these spectral reflectance patterns, they are influenced by the temporal, spatial, and atmospheric factors, all three of these. Temporal factors, what do you mean by temporal factors? Suppose you are looking at the same location in the summer when the leaves shed, and maybe in the spring when the leaves are very green. Right? So will the spectral reflections pattern of a particular vegetation at a particular location be different at different time periods? Yes, that is the temporal variation in the spectral reflectance pattern. And what about spatial reflectance pattern? For a same feature, depending upon its indigenous characteristics at different locations at the same time period, the spectral reflectance pattern can be different, right? And another major influencing parameter is the atmospheric factor. So we will see that first. Okay, so this atmospheric factors, the major thing is that there will be some additional radiance on the object, or there will be some reduction in the radiance as well due to some atmospheric scattering, further atmospheric scattering. So the atmosphere interactions of the electromagnetic radiation in the atmosphere, that affects the brightness or radiance that is sensed by your sensor. So there is a possibility for a reduction in the energy that is available for illuminating an object, right? We saw yesterday, I mean, in the first class, we saw how from the energy, the electromagnetic radiation, it travels from the source to the earth feature through the atmosphere, and how how there will be some interactions in the atmosphere, and how it is reflected back from the feature, and further it again interacts while it travels through the atmosphere, and it is finally sensed by the sensor, right? So there can be a chance, there is a chance of reduced energy which is available for illuminating an object. Why? Because there can be some absorption and there can be some scattering, right? Then this atmosphere, it acts as a reflector, adding a scattered extra path radiance to the radiance from the object as well. So once it is reflected, once the electromagnetic radiation what is sensed by our sensor, there can be an additional radiance too, because some energy will be scattered in the atmosphere, and that radiation can also be sensed by our sensor, isn't it? If you look at this figure, you can see from the source, which is the sun, there is a sunlight, there is some incident radiation, which is E, which is the irradiance on the object, that is the incoming energy on the object. It falls on a particular surface feature and it has some reflectance represented by rho. What is reflectance? We saw yesterday what is reflectance. What is reflectance? Anyone?
The wavelengths which are retransmitted by an object.
No, reflectance. Reflectance is a ratio, no? Spectral
reflected
reflectance.
wavelength to incident wavelength, energy of
It's not the
reflected
ratio of the wavelength.
like it's energy, sir. Energy.
Energy, correct,
Energy.
exactly. Reflected energy to the incident energy, right? So, based on the reflectance of that feature, this incident radiation, it is reflected, and that reflected energy is given by it as a function of the radiance, that is the incoming radiation, then the transmission, then the reflectance, right? So rho Et by pi, that is my reflected energy. So the sensor, it captures this reflected energy along with some path radiance. You can see LP. So from the source, there will be some interactions in the atmosphere which can scatter that energy, and that scattered energy can also be absorbed by this sensor, right? Observed by this sensor, right? So the total radiance observed by the sensor, L tot, will be equal to rho Et by pi, which is a function of the reflected energy plus some path radiance as well. So a person should have an idea about the atmospheric conditions, and they should also consider the path radiance while deciding on the, or interpreting the spectral reflectance pattern of a Earth surface feature. All right. So the total spectral radiance measured by a sensor is given by L tot is equal to the reflected energy plus the path radiance, rho Et by pi plus LP. So all these factors, it basically depends upon the wavelength of interactions and uh, the irradiance on the object. We know that the main source of irradiance or incoming energy is from the sun. So that is one source of illumination, that is directly reflected sunlight. But again, there is one more, that is the diffused skylight or skylight that has been previously scattered by the atmosphere. There will already be some energy which has been scattered by interactions in the atmosphere, and that also can provide some irradiance on an object, and these all things will be reflected and will be sensed by the sensor along with some further scattered energy or path radiance. So which one will dominate, whether the direct sunlight will dominate or whether the diffused skylight will dominate, that depends upon the present weather conditions. It also depends upon the varying seasons, the solar elevation angle, difference in the path length or path distance, etc. So all these factors can affect your total irradiance and your path radiance, right? So coming to the Earth's surface features. So what was the spectral reflectance curve? So different features on the Earth's surface have different spectral reflectance patterns. So we saw the spectral reflectance pattern of one feature yesterday, that is vegetation, and we saw how it varies. And I hope you guys understood why leaves look green and why the spectral reflectance pattern of vegetation looked like that. Any doubt in that? So the plot between spectral reflectance and the wavelength, it is called the spectral reflectance curve, right? Here you can see the reflectance versus wavelength, right? So yesterday we saw the spectral reflectance pattern of vegetation. Here you can see the green line that represents the spectral reflectance pattern of vegetation. So this is a very generalized spectral reflectance pattern or spectral reflectance curve. All right. So within this vegetation, these lines are just averaged out spectral reflectance pattern of that particular Earth feature. And within this vegetation, we saw different spectral reflectance curves for a particular feature, but different conditions or different species, right? So these different lines here, different curves here, they represent the reflectance versus the wavelength. So that is a spectral reflectance curve. So that varies with the variation in the composition and conditions of the feature. So that gives you a range of values of reflectance based on yesterday. For example, in yesterday's vegetation we saw, depending upon the chlorophyll content, your reflectance can vary, right? If the chlorophyll is high, then it will it will absorb the shorter wavelength and longer wavelength in the visible spectrum, right? So that you can see that it looks green. But if the chlorophyll content is very less, it will not absorb much of the shorter wavelength. So a combination of longer wavelengths, the green and red, a combination of that you will observe, and you will observe it as brown or yellowish color, right? So we saw that. So depending upon the chemical composition and physical conditions of the feature, you will see a variation in the spectral reflectance curve of different features. So these spectral response patterns, they are averaged to get a generalized form. As I showed you now, here you can see this green line represents a generalized spectral reflectance pattern or spectral response pattern, or a generalized spectral response pattern for the particular Earth feature. And that spectral response pattern, this is an averaged out spectral response, but within that particular feature, as we saw yesterday, for different vegetation, these spectral reflectance pattern can be different, which can be used to identify different species in that vegetation, right? So those different spectral reflectance patterns or curves for specific features, it's called a spectral signature. So that will be unique. It's a unique spectral response pattern for a particular terrain feature. So is the difference between spectral response pattern and spectral signature clear? What we see here for this vegetation, this green line, this is a spectral signature or spectral reflectance pattern. As the name suggests, it's a pattern, right? Spectral reflectance pattern. The pattern of vegetation. Generally, vegetation will look like this, right? So this is the pattern for vegetation. But does all vegetations look like this? Does all vegetation have exactly the same reflectance pattern? No, right? So for different species, we saw the reflectance were different, right? So this for a specific feature, for different features, for different specific terrain features, the spectral reflectance pattern will be unique to for that particular feature. So that unique spectral reflectance pattern is called the spectral signature. So yesterday we saw the spectral signature for different species of plants, right? Right. So these lines are spectral reflectance pattern or generalized pattern for, so that we can discuss how this general pattern or variation of spectral reflectance is. All right. So here you have another generalized spectral reflectance pattern. On the bottom figure, you can see grass, gypsum, pure gypsum, sand, concrete, asphalt, etc. So in this figure, you can see, yeah, here. So here you can see grass, gypsum, sand, then sand, snow, these etc. Gypsum, sand, grass, snow, they have high spectral reflectance at low wavelengths, and that gradually decreases with an increase in wavelength, right? Are you observing that from the figure? Grass, gypsum, sand, snow, they have high spectral reflectance at low wavelengths, isn't it? And that reflectance gradually decreases with an increase in wavelength. But if you look at soil, soil have low spectral reflectance at low wavelengths, and it increases with wavelengths, and then it further decreases, right? Soil, you can see the spectral reflectance of soil there, right? Then concrete and asphalt, they have a gradual increase in spectral reflectance with an increase in wavelength, right? Concrete and asphalt. You can see in the second figure. Then clouds, they have very high spectral reflectance at low wavelength. So very high reflectance, isn't it? For clouds and snow, when you look at them, they what color do they look like? Clouds and snow, they look white, right? So very high reflectance in the visible wavelength. In the low wavelength region, they have very high reflectance, and that slightly decreases with wavelength. The clouds they have their spectral reflectance, it slightly decreases with wavelength, right? So then the last one, water. You can see water. So water has very low spectral reflectance, and that too at less than about 0.9 micrometer. Nothing above that is reflected from clear water. So these are generalized spectral reflectance pattern for all these features on the Earth's surface. So let us see some of these features in detail today. All right, spectral reflectance pattern of Earth features. So I have cropped one image from that group of images, from that group of 3 images, and I have kept it here for reference. So spectral reflectance patterns of vegetation, we saw that already yesterday for different species, how it looks. So this here I will give you a generalized response pattern. Okay. So if you are considering healthy vegetation, the spectral reflectance pattern of healthy vegetation, if you look at it, it will have a peak and valley configuration. You can see that dark line in that, it represents grass, green grass, which is healthy vegetation. So you can see a peak and valley configuration. You have a peak at about green visible spectrum 0.5, then a valley about the red, then it again peaks up to about 1.4, then it drops. So you can see a peak and valley configuration for healthy vegetation. So the initial portion we saw yesterday, why it happens, because the chlorophyll absorbs energy in the wavelengths between 0.45 and 0.67, the chlorophyll absorption bands, right? And high absorption of blue and red bands happens, and high reflectance of green bands happens. So we perceive it as green color, right? We saw that yesterday. So if the plants are stressed, or if the plants are aging, or if with the variation in the seasons, they decrease their chlorophyll production. So what happens? Your blue and red absorption will decrease. So you can see above dry grass. Can you see that? So in dry grass, you can see not only green, red is also reflected, blue is also reflected. So there is no peak valley configuration for in the visible wavelength itself. So those grasses, dry grass, it will, you will observe it as, you can see high reflectance in the green and red wavelengths, right? About above 0.5 to 0.7, you can see high reflectance. So what color you may experience this as? Dry grass, yellowish or brownish color, right? So there is no peak and valley configuration there. You can see high reflectance. The reflectance keeps on increasing with the increase in wavelength. And above about 1.4, maybe in the IR range, you can see some slight variations in the peak and valley. So if you are trying to observe these two, healthy and weak vegetation, maybe you can refer your visible, you can use a remote sensing with the sensor of sensor in the visible wavelength range itself, isn't it? Right? So for a dry grass, the red reflectance increases, so we perceive it as yellow or brown, which is a combination of green and red. And the reflectance of healthy vegetation, if you look at that figure, you can see that the reflectance of healthy vegetation, it further increases beyond the near IR range, that is above 0.7 micrometer. And from 0.7 to 1.3 micrometer, the leaves reflect about 40 to 50% of the incident energy. The remaining is transmitted, and there is minimal absorption in the 0.7 to 1.3 micrometer range. You can observe that. And due to the internal structure of plants, this reflection is different, and that helps in differentiating the plant species, as we saw yesterday, right? We saw that yesterday, right? How the spectral reflectance is unique for different species in higher wavelengths. So beyond 1.3 micrometer, the incident energy is absorbed or reflected, and the transmission is minimal. So you can further see some dips, the valleys configurations at 1.4, 1.9, 2.7 micrometer, etc. That is due to the presence of water in leaves, and this further peaks at 1.6 and 2.2 micrometer. So why is there, due to the presence of water in the leaves, why are there dips at 1.4, 1.9, 2.7, etc.? Why? What do you think? There is water in these leaves. In good healthy leaves there will be water content, and you can see that there are dips at about 1.4, 1.9, then 2.2, etc. There are some dips. Why does that happen? So at this 1.4, at 1.9, about 2.2, etc., the absorption of water, the absorption of energy by water is higher, and for healthy vegetation there will be good moisture content in the leaves, and therefore you can see those dips. So is that clear? And in dry grass, grasses, the moisture content also will be very less. That is why the dips are not very prominent. Is that clear? Is that behavior clear? Yeah, and beyond 1.3 micrometer, that reflectance is inversely related to water content in the leaves. And further, the reflectance also increases with the number of leaf layers. So if you have a very thick canopy, of leaves or plants or trees, you can see that the reflectance further increases. So the total spectral reflectance in the case of vegetation, it will be a function of moisture content and leaf thickness both. All right, clear? Is the spectral reflectance pattern of vegetation clear? Next, let's see the spectral reflectance pattern of soil. So here you can see dry soil and wet soil. On the top right image you can see. Can you see that? Dry soil and wet soil. Yes, so here again, let me start with wet soil. You can see similar dips in the spectral reflectance pattern of wet soil, about 1.4, 1.9, after 2.2, about 2.4. At these points, you can see a dip. Why is that? Because moisture content is present, and that is going to absorb energy at wavelengths of 1.4, 1.9, etc. So that atmospheric windows are there, right? So if you look at dry soil, you can see that there is not much of a peak and valley pattern. You can see that yellow line, dry soil, 5% water only. So very slight dips at 1.4, 1.9 and 2.4. So, very less content of water. So if it is absolutely dry, then there will not be much variation in the peak and valley pattern, might not be much prominent. So the spectral reflectance pattern of soil, it basically depends upon the moisture content, organic matter content, soil texture, surface roughness, presence of iron oxide, etc. Why is this surface roughness important? Diffuse and specular, right? So if it is like a mirror, it's an ideal condition of specular, and if it is reflecting in all directions, it is a example of ideal diffuse reflector, right? So depending upon the surface roughness, this reflection can vary. So again, as we already mentioned, the spectral reflectance pattern, it depends upon moisture content, organic matter content, presence of iron oxide, soil texture and surface roughness. So of course, when there is large moisture content, its spectral reflectance drops at longer wavelengths, right? In all wavelengths, it drops a bit, but at particular wavelengths, at those particular atmospheric windows, you can see there is a larger drop, right? So, it's strongly related to the soil texture as well, depending upon whether it is coarse soil, sandy soil, or clay soil, and further, depending upon the soil texture, the drainage also varies a lot, right? So surface drainage of particular soil types, it also varies a lot. If it is a very coarse or sandy soil, then the drainage will be very high, so that the moisture content will be low on the surface where you are looking at. But if it is a clay soil, it can retain the moisture content for a very long time because the permeability is very less, isn't it? Further, if there is iron oxide, that further absorbs some radiation, so that again it reduces reflectance. And absorption and reflectance characteristics, further it is strongly dependent on the parent material and its mineral composition. So quartz, gypsum, different soil uh, types, depending upon its uh, parent material, its absorption, reflectance, transmission, etc. will be different. Absorption and transmittance is not considered in the case of soils because they are generally opaque, isn't it? So the major influencing parameter here is the reflectance itself, where the reflectance is further dependent upon soil moisture, the soil texture, surface roughness, and presence of some other contents like organic matter or iron oxide. Clear? Spectral reflectance pattern of soil. Next, moving on. Here is the spectral reflectance pattern of water. Can you see that figure? So you can see spectral reflectance pattern of clear lake water and turbid river water. So you have already read about the reflectance of water in your homework yesterday. So you have some idea. Let us further discuss it now. So here you can see clear water, energy absorption is there at the near IR wavelengths and the wavelengths above that. So, using an IR band remote sensing data, it is very easy to delineate water bodies because the reflectance will be nil, isn't it? If you are looking at a figure, looking at a picture that was sensed in the near IR range, where is the near IR? Above 750 to 800 nanometers or 0.8 micrometers, you can see clear lake water. There is zero reflectance, isn't it? Is there any reflectance? If it is clear lake water, the reflectance is zero, right? After about 0.75 to 0.8 micrometers, right? So if you obtain an image sensed in the near IR band, you can see that the places where there is water bodies, what will they look like? It will look like black, right? So you can easily identify water bodies if the image is sensed in the near IR band, isn't it? So the interaction of energy, it happens on the water surface because this water plane, clear water surface, it acts like a specular reflector, and if there are suspended matter and materials at the bottom of the water body, further energy interactions happen there. So clear water, as we see in this figure, that absorbs the energy above about 0.6 or 0.7 micrometer, and there is high transmission below that, right? Below, or I mean above that particular wavelengths. But if you are considering turbid river water, they have high reflectance due to lesser transmission. Why? The water will not be transmitted through, but if you have a lot of suspended material, if the water is turbid, what will happen? You will have higher reflectance, isn't it? Do you agree to that? You have clear lake water. In the visible range, you can see that some of the energy, very less energy, is reflected. However, remaining energy is transmitted through the water. It is not reflected onto the sensor. It is transmitted through the water. But if you have high suspended matter, you have a very polluted water, suppose, then what will happen? The transmission will get lowered and the reflection will get higher, right? Suppose you have clear water and turbid river water. So if you have a clear lake water, you can see that the reflectance is something in the 10% range in the visible spectrum, right? The remaining energy, what will happen to the remaining energy? Some of it is absorbed and some of the remaining it is transmitted. The energy just passes through the water, right? But if you have a turbid river water, suppose you have a lot of suspended material and all in the water, what will happen? The energy will not be transmitted through the water, but this surface, the suspended materials on the surface, what will happen? The energy will reflect from that suspended material, right? So the reflectance can be higher in the case of turbid waters. So if you further again, if you look at water with high chlorophyll content, what will happen? If there is water with high chlorophyll content, what can happen? If there is an algal bloom or phytoplankton growth, etc., in these conditions the chlorophyll content will increase, right? So what will happen? Generally your overall reflectance is going to drop, isn't it? Because the energy in the red and blue wavelengths are going to be absorbed by chlorophyll, right? So you might observe a slight bump alone, very slight bump in the 0.5 or green band, right? But other than that, the overall reflectance is going to drop because the energy, overall the energy is going to be reduced because it's going to be absorbed by the chlorophyll, isn't it? Yeah. So if you have chlorophyll content, If you have turbidity in the water, your reflectance pattern is going to largely vary, right? So this can be used, this phenomenon or this characteristics or this spectral reflectance pattern, it can be used to identify any algal bloom, any phytoplankton growth, presence of tanning dyes, any pollutants, oil spills, etc. in water using remote sensing images. You might have seen in the news, sometimes people might have quantified how much area is affected due to a oil spill from a container ship, right? You might have read it in the news also, isn't it? A large oil spill happens in the ocean, and people will quantify how much area has been covered with this oil spill, and how much marine ecology is affected and all. You might have read news about it, isn't it? So how do they quantify this? So they can observe this reflectance patterns and they can quantify. You can just visualize it. Try to imagine it. You have a ocean which have a particular, at that particular temporal and spatial location, you have a particular reflectance pattern. And suppose you have a large oil spill, then the reflectance pattern is going to be much different, right? The reflectance is going to be very high, right? So you can easily quantify from that image how much area is affected due to this oil spill. Is that clear? Similarly, algal blooms, phytoplankton growth, presence of tanning dyes, all these pollutions, everything in water, this can be quantified depending, if you have a good knowledge of the spectral reflectance pattern of water. So here again, you can see another figure. You can see clear water and water with high chlorophyll content and water with high dissolved organic carbon. Right. So high chlorophyll, you can see there is a peak in the green range and there is a drop in the blue range. Right. Moving on to spectral reflectance pattern of snow and clouds. So here you can see in the bottom figure, you can see snow and clouds. If you look from the top, maybe if you are observing from a flight, it will be very difficult to distinguish which is snow, which is cloud, isn't it? Do you agree? Because both will look very white, isn't it? Both snow and clouds, if you look from an airplane, it might look very similar, isn't it? Both might look very white, isn't it? Or even if you're taking an aerial photography, aerial photograph using a sensor in the visible spectrum, maybe using a camera, you are taking a photo from above. Will it be easy to distinguish what is cloud, what is snow? Will it be easy? What do you think? Both are similar in the visible ranges, and both are having very high reflectance. You can see here clouds have a reflectance of about 80% and snow has a reflectance of almost 100% in the visible range, isn't it? So it is very difficult to distinguish these in the visible range. But if you look at uh, a higher wavelength, maybe above 1.4, we can see that the spectral reflectance of clouds, they have higher spectral reflectance at longer wavelengths above 1.4 when compared to that of snow. So if you have a camera or a sensor that takes pictures in the wavelengths above 1.4, do you think it will be easy to distinguish them too? Because you can see for clouds at about 1.4 micrometer, you can see that the reflectance is about 60%, and for snow it is just about 10%. Is that clear? So you can easily distinguish clouds and snow if you use a sensor which operates in the 1.4 to 1.6 wavelength range. Clear? So all these spectral reflectance patterns we discussed earlier. So these are separable in the near infrared wavelengths, isn't it? Most of these you can see in the near infrared. If you look at this graph, itself, you can see almost in the near infrared range. You can see that most of these Earth features are separable, right? So most Earth features can be identified in the near infrared range, and if you are looking for specific applications, then what you have to do is you have to choose your sensor, at what wavelength your sensor operates, that you have to choose accordingly for your specific application. So even though it is most of the features are generally most of the features, even if it is separable in the near IR wavelengths, as we discussed earlier, some factors that can affect this spectral reflections pattern. So two of those factors are temporal effects and spatial effects. If you are looking at, if you have a near IR sensor, you have a satellite you have a satellite which captures our campus, let us say our campus. It is taking the photo of our campus every day. It is taking photos in the 1.4 to 1.6 wavelength. Suppose it is taking a photo every day. It's orbiting and every day it is taking a photo. Temporal effects will be there, isn't it? What do you mean by this temporal effect? So if you take a photo in the summer and if you take a photo in the spring season, it's going to be largely different. For the same location, it is for the same location, for the same feature, the spectral reflectance pattern is going to be different, right? And if you're looking at the same feature at two different locations, they might have different characteristics, and that is called spatial effect. Factors that cause same type of features at a given point in time to have different characteristics at different geographic locations. Same type of plant inside our campus and somewhere outside at the same amount of time, at the same period of time, it might have some differences, maybe a difference in moisture content or different stress in the plants. Maybe these factors can cause difference in spectral reflectance pattern of the same feature at the same time, but at two different locations. So, these effects, the temporal effects and spatial effects, they complicate the use of analyzing the spectral reflectance properties of Earth's resources. But however, as we just mentioned, as in the case of vegetation, it is helpful in change detection or assessing stressed or infected vegetation. Suppose, stressed or infected vegetation, let us say, maybe in Navakare, you have a same coconut orchard. Suppose you have a coconut orchard in Navakare, and we have a coconut orchard inside our campus. Inside our campus, we are watering the orchard every day. It's very well maintained. But maybe in Navakare, it is not being looked after, and it's the same species. It's coconut tree, right? Same species, and that trees are in the stressed condition. Suppose they are not getting enough water, their chlorophyll production has reduced. So you can easily detect, based on these spatial effects, you can easily detect which one of these vegetations is stressed or needs monitoring, right? Is that clear? So using that spatial effects, at the same time, on the same day, you are observing the same feature at two geographic locations, and you will be able to compare its spectral reflectance pattern, and you will be able to identify what is happening to a particular feature. You may be able to identify that. So this, temporal and spatial effects like this will be helpful in change detection and assessing stressed or infected vegetation. All right. So that's all about spectral reflectance patterns. So if you look at this figure, the top figure is captured by a camera operating in the visible spectrum, and the bottom image, it is the same location captured at the same time, but using a camera that operates or using a sensor that operates in the IR range. Okay. What do you observe from these two figures? You can see a stadium based on the spectral reflectance. What do you observe? It's an artificial turf. Okay. It's an artificial turf inside the stadium. It's an artificial turf. It's not actual grass, but outside you can see it is actual vegetation. So the spectral reflectance pattern is different for the outside vegetation and the artificial turf. The reflectance is the same. So for different wavelengths, the reflectance of different materials can be different, and that can be easily used to identify specific features. If you look at the image captured in the visible spectra, we can see that all these will look green, isn't it? All these are green. All this vegetation inside the stadium, these are all green color. But actually inside the stadium, that is an artificial turf. So the reflectance in the near IR range, doesn't make any difference to that from the visible spectrum. So that means the reflectance is almost the same, isn't it, for that particular feature, right? So you can, the applications are endless. The applications are actually endless. You can fiddle with different wavelengths, you can fiddle with different reflectances, and you can, using this spectral reflectance pattern of different features, you can use it to characterize different features on the Earth surface. You can characterize within a feature, you can characterize different species, or further classifications. You can identify soil. You can identify different types of soil. You can use it for mining. You can use it for the petroleum industry. You can use it for monitoring deforestation. You can use it to monitor stress in the plants. You can monitor evergreen and deciduous forests. The applications are endless. You can use it for city planning, urban planning, road planning, highway planning. All these, the applications are actually endless. This is just one simple interesting example that I showed you. Another one here, you can see the figure. It shows the ocean chlorophyll concentration. You can see dark blue is very less, and higher ones are higher chlorophyll content, and also the normalized differential vegetation index, whether the land cover, it is vegetation or not, that also can be observed from this image. Greener means more uh, green land cover, and towards the orange color or yellowish color, it is minimum vegetation. So you can see the Sahara desert and all, minimum vegetation. uh, Greenland, you can see minimum vegetation, right? And Brazil area, you can see there is high vegetation, etc. So the applications are endless. You can use it for change detection, you can use it for mapping, you can use it for feature identification. The applications are endless. It's just one another example that I showed you. All right, so we will stop for now.